CBRE invests in technology so that we can help you invest in your future. Find out more about how we can help you at cbre.com.
Welcome to the Silicon Slopes Town Hall. Today we're joined by Senator Mike Lee. How are you, Senator?
Doing great, thank you.
Awesome, thank you for being here. This came together in record time, at least for us, 18 hours from the time Robert called me, one of your staffers, to sending out the invites and everything. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
All right, so setting the table a little bit, we will talk about the HERO Act, the Promise Act, Section 230, Spectrum Access and Development, data privacy, and immigration issues related to the tech industry. But we'll also sprinkle in some fun questions.
Sounds great.
We'll start with that, and then for those in the audience, please have questions ready as it pertains to topics that you're interested in. So we'll probably go for 15, 20 minutes, and then I'll open it up to Q&A. All right, so what led you to become a senator?
It was about 12 years ago when I first started giving it thought. I became concerned that there were a lot of things happening in Washington, D.C. without a whole lot of questions being asked or answered. I started giving speeches throughout the state about the Constitution, based on concerns I had with how quickly Congress was moving to expand the size, the scope, and the cost of the federal government. And this was often happening without any meaningful discussion from people in either House of Congress or in either political party for what Congress's authority was. So I developed this theory that, people need to start talking more about the twin structural protections of the Constitution. The vertical protection we call federalism, and the horizontal protection we call separation of powers. If you allow that system to function well, it's a recipe for having good government in America, because you're going to allow each decision to be made at the appropriate level of government. And it's going to naturally serve as a check on the tendency in human nature for government to grow and for people within government to amass too much power and then to abuse it. Long story short, these speeches ended up over the long haul morphing into a Senate campaign, and I won. It's an unlikely campaign in many respects. I'd never previously held elected office, and was not one who from the outside would have been viewed as a likely challenger for that reason. But the message resonated to a significant degree, more than I had anticipated, and ended up winning.
Yeah. And the rest is history.
Yes.
All right, so I know I'm interested, and I know folks that I straw polled are interested. What is a typical week, to the best that you can, for a United States Senator?
We'll have votes usually Monday through Friday in a typical week. And the senators, any senator's time tends to be divided several different ways while in Washington. It's divided up in a combination of votes, committee hearings, constituent meetings, meetings with one's own staff developing legislative strategy, and interviews with the news media. Most of almost any senator's week would be divided up between those 4 or 5 things while in Washington.
And what's the best part of the week?
In some ways, the best part of the week just consists of moments when all the senators are together, especially when we've got back-to-back votes, and we're on the Senate floor and we have the opportunity to interact freely for, sometimes it's for an hour or two, sometimes it's longer. We occasionally have these voting marathons called Votes-a-Rama that in some cases last literally for 24 hours. We had one that lasted 24, 25, maybe 26 hours just a couple of weeks ago. It's during those times when whether it's for an hour or two or much longer, where we're interacting casually, nobody else has any place else they have to be because you've got to be right there, where a lot of the magic happens, where you'll be having a conversation with someone, maybe within your own party, maybe within the other party, and you'll realize that you've got a shared interest in something. And you'll realize that there is an opportunity for a legislative connection, for a lot of bipartisan agreement in an area where you didn't used to have it. It's a great moment.
Yeah. All right, so politics aside, who's the funniest senator as far as humor goes, personality?
Okay, until a couple of years ago, I would have said hands down Al Franken. I mean, Al Franken and I disagree on a lot of things politically, but I consider him a dear friend. Al and I get together periodically for dinner still. We also are regular texting buddies. He harasses me about this or that political position that he regards as heretical, and sometimes vice versa. But Al is hilarious. I got to work with him on the Judiciary Committee. He was literally on the set of Saturday Night Live as an actor and as a writer.
Yeah.
He's very, very funny. Marco Rubio from Florida is really, really funny. He's got a very well-developed sense of humor. Probably could write comedy if he had to.
Yeah, maybe that'll be his second act. All right, so let's jump into a little bit of policy. So some of the things we're going to talk about first would be the HERO Act. Quick primer on what that is, your thoughts on it, and the work you've done with it.
A few years ago, I started developing a proposal to overhaul our higher education system. In higher education, unlike primary and secondary education, the federal government has a more significant role to play there, because with primary and secondary education, it's normally going to be, and normally should be, an issue for state and local governments. Well, with higher education, people routinely travel from one state to another in order to get a higher education experience, so our involvement there is a little bit more significant. I developed this proposal, the Higher Education Reform Opportunity Act, in response to a few data points that I kept running into. Number one, we've got an evolving economy and an evolving workforce that increasingly needs people with a different set of skills than what your traditional brick and mortar higher education experience necessarily churns out with the greatest regularity. And I don't mean in any way to undermine the role of or the need for the brick and mortar higher education learning institution or for the traditional four-year degree. That's not it at all. It's just that there is a lot to higher education that perhaps exists or should be able to exist outside of that space, where in many instances you've got companies that really need people trained in a particular thing. And that thing might take years to develop within the curriculum of a traditional university. I wanted to increase access to federal higher education assistance and promote the development of more of these experiences that don't necessarily fit within that system. So things like massive open online courses, accreditation programs, certain types of apprenticeships, and professional certifications. These all ought to be things that people have the opportunity to participate in through federal higher education assistance. And we've found over time that there is something of an iron triangle that exists between the traditional four-year institution, the U.S. Department of Education, and the accrediting bodies that are recognized by the U.S. Department of Education. I'd like to break that up a little bit, and part of what we do through the Higher Education Reform Opportunity Act, or the HERO Act, is to give states the option, if they would like, of creating their own alternative certification accreditation program, one that we could recognize through the federal government. Anyway, there are a lot of details to this. If you're interested in learning more about it, you can go to my website at lee.senate.gov and then search for HERO Act or Higher Education Reform Act, and would love to know what people think.
Yeah, and flexibility is going to kind of be the key.
Increasingly, especially in the wake of COVID. I think the HERO Act was ahead of its time in many ways because it's never been more important than in the wake of COVID.
Yeah, and you can get up to speed fairly quickly on some complex stuff if you put your head down for a month or 3 months, 6 months, and it can change your life fairly quickly. We've had interns that, as part of their internship, they learned how to operate Domo at a high level. I'm way too dumb to operate it, but they've, gotten certificates, and even just that small little arrow in their quiver is valuable. And all it took was some elbow grease and just learning how to do it. All right, so perception versus reality as it relates to your relationships with your colleagues in government and the Senate. Outside perception might be that it's a battle royale, but what's the actual perception?
Yeah, look, there are those areas where there is a lot of disagreement between the two political parties. But the media's coverage of this, understandably, but unfortunately often leaves people with some mistaken impressions. While you would often walk away from a lot of media coverage thinking that members of Congress, including members of the Senate, where I serve, really just hate the other side. That isn't true. It's not always true. In my view, it is manifestly contrary to fact. In any job that most people have ever had, there will be people you work with whom you agree on a lot of things. There will be people you work with whom you disagree on a lot of things. And I don't mean politically here, but just strategically, what you view as the best business strategy, the best sort of next step for your company to take. There will be people who take a different viewpoint than you do. If you're like me and like most people, you wouldn't necessarily put those people in the category of least favorite colleagues. To me, those travel on different genomes. They're part of a different calculation. A lot of the people, not just in this job, but in any job, are people who maybe have a different perspective than I do, but I still really value their opinion. And when we do agree, it makes it that much more poignant, the fact that we do. That's a lot how the Senate is. Not only are Democrats some of my favorite people in the Senate, there are a lot of my favorite people in the Senate. And sometimes they're people who are least like me politically. I love Bernie Sanders. You could say I'm feeling the burn in that respect. I love the guy. Now, he and I disagree on all sorts of things, most things. You know, he has described himself as a socialist, and I'm never described that way. He's from Vermont, and I'm from Utah. He grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in Provo. We're very different backgrounds, very different worldviews. But I really like him, in part because he's a straight shooter. He's blunt. He's to the point. I really like Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota. She and I have taken turns being the chairman and ranking member on the antitrust subcommittee, and we serve together on the Judiciary Committee. Joe Manchin from West Virginia is a dear friend. We have dinner together about once a week. And the list really goes on and on. But we genuinely do like each other. In those areas where we disagree, and there are some areas where the parties really are more or less deadlocked against each other along party lines, it makes it tough. But those disagreements are, in my view, born not of petulant unwillingness to compromise or see each other's viewpoint. Those reflect genuine differences of opinion, and genuine differences of opinion not just among ourselves, but among those who voted to put us in office. So I think that's a better way of viewing it.
Yeah.
When you look at the headlines or even the video clips, the things they focus on tend to be those moments where somebody speaks up, or where things get testy in a minute. If in your job there were a camera crew following you around all the time, I can imagine that there might well be times where if there was a national news media audience watching, if those were the only scenes where you had a moment of contention in a meeting, if those were the only scenes that members of the public saw, they might walk away with a very different impression of you and of your coworkers. And that's kind of how it is in the Senate.
Yeah, that's good to hear, and that's why I asked the question. And it's always fun hearing those stories. All right, Section 230, let's talk about that. What is it? What are your thoughts on it? What are any updates?
Okay, so Section 230 of the Telecommunications Decency Act is something that's become somewhat controversial, in part because it identifies basically for a wide swath of tech platforms, a lot of people in the tech space. It allows people to operate without a crippling type of liability exposure that they would otherwise face. So in other words, if you run, the best way of describing this is to refer to the social media industry. If you run a social media company, or something with online commentary of one sort or another, so that it in some ways resembles a social media network, you're going to want to have the ability to moderate some of that conversation. Maybe you won't, but most people would, in part just to make sure that things stay on topic, and to one degree or another, you want to be able to take out certain kinds of conversations, particularly those advocating criminal conduct, acts of violence against others, and so forth. In the course of doing that, your judgment calls about what you moderate and what you don't, what you take down, what you leave up, shouldn't itself put you in a position where you're going to be subjected to liability if you touch it. So it's one of the things that Congress had in mind when it adopted Section 230, was to say, we don't want to discourage people from touching it. If we're going to force people, by virtue of their liability exposure, to just do nothing to moderate commentary, to moderate what people post on their sites or through their platform, then a lot of bad stuff will happen. So we should give them a degree of immunity if they want to moderate those things. So that's where it has come out. Now, there have been a lot of criticisms of Section 230 with some good reason, and they're very understandable, legitimate concerns, many of which I share, including the fact that you've got a lot of big tech platforms, including the social media giants, who somewhat selectively moderate. And sometimes it ends up reflecting the political ideology of the company in question. A lot have responded to that by saying maybe we should get rid of Section 230 altogether. I've pushed back on that, because if you got rid of Section 230, if you just repealed it altogether, it would give, in my view, an undue advantage to big market incumbents in the social media industry, for example, to established incumbent giants like Facebook and like Twitter, and in the search engine space, to entities like Google. Why? Well, because they can afford an army of compliance specialists and lobbyists and lawyers for when they get sued. They can manage that risk on their own. If you just got rid of Section 230 altogether, it's the smaller new market entrants that would be potentially crushed as a result of that. So I've tried to think of ways that we could either improve Section 230, and there are ways to do that, some of which made their way through the Senate Judiciary Committee last year, or alternatively, supplement Section 230, or both. That's where the Promise Act comes in. I've introduced something called the Promise Act that would say to these social media companies and other tech giants, if you want to sell yourselves to the public as a neutral arbiter of facts in a certain area, and if you're willing to say, look, we're going to moderate so that we take down content that either advocates for violence against a certain group of people or is hateful in the following specific ways, or that displays pornographic images, we'll take it down. But once you make those statements as a company, you need to stick to those. The problem we've had with a lot of these companies is that they'll make statements both in their official terms of service agreements with their customers, but also through statements made publicly by their CEOs, claiming that they are politically neutral, and then they'll do the opposite of that. That is deceptive. It's misleading. And it ought to be illegal. I think it's already arguably illegal. But the Promise Act would expand the jurisdiction of the Federal Trade Commission, an entity that I don't love in the abstract, but that here has a purpose. Expand the jurisdiction under Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act so as to empower the FTC to demand corrective action when one of these tech platforms deviates. After publicly promising over and over again, oh, we're politically neutral, then behaving in a manner that's manifestly contrary to that, the Promise Act would subject them to corrective action by the FTC. The reason I've concluded that this was necessary is that over the last 6 or 8 months, I've had the CEOs of these tech giant platforms, including Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others, in front of my committee on 2 different committees. I sit on 2 committees that have jurisdiction in this area. The Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over the FTC, and the Judiciary Committee, which has jurisdiction over a lot of things, including the Department of Justice. What I discovered was appalling. I asked these CEOs, I gave them instance after instance, where in the right of center space, political ad after political ad or political post after political post has been taken down or blocked or otherwise subjected to more aggressive treatment by the tech company at issue. And I rattled off 5 or 6 of these examples to them, and I said, can you name a single instance where some corresponding action has been taken on the left, toward a left-leaning candidate or policy advocacy group? And in each instance, in each hearing, each one of these CEOs said something as if they had agreed upon it in advance, even though they hadn't, because they couldn't have. They didn't know I was going to ask it. But they each said on cue, oh, well, we've got people on the left and right mad at us. And I said, yeah, that's really not the point. That's true. They do have people on the left mad at them, but for different reasons. Those who are mad at them on the left usually are mad at them because they don't think they're doing enough to take down other content. That is a different question than I presented to them. Name me a single example of where a Facebook or Google or Twitter ad or commentary has been taken down in the left of center space, analogous to these 15 or 20 examples that any one of us could rattle off in a heartbeat. Not one of them could answer it. And I think that's deeply troubling. Now, the problems with Section 230 and the problems in this space are not limited to political speech, but it is a significant area. And make no mistake, I believe that any company, if it wants to, can go on and be as activist in on the left or the right or any direction they want. That is their choice. What is not their choice is their ability to mislead their customers and the public by saying we are in fact politically neutral when the facts manifest contrary to be true.
All right, so Section 230 kind of found itself in no man's land. It's hated by the left and right for various reasons. Not a good spot to be. So then the Promise Act was your solution to Section 230.
Yes. No, I don't mean it to be an exclusive solution, but I think it is a reasonably achievable step toward some sort of sanity in this area. I've also supported some proposals to tweak Section 230 to clarify it. None of those proposals appear to be in a position to gain much momentum, but I think the Promise Act does have some potential for bipartisan agreement.
Gotcha. All right, so you're in the media a lot, print, video, digital, all of it. What do you or your team, what recourses do you have when you do a story, you do an interview, and what comes out is inaccurate? What do you and your team do when that happens? It happens.
It happens. And generally, we just reach out to the media entity at issue. And it tends to be an easier thing if it's a simple objective fact where they said X when the answer is Y, or they said Y when the answer is X, and it's objectively provable. In that circumstance, it's usually a pretty easy phone call or a combination of phone calls and texts, sometimes from me personally, sometimes from a member of my staff to the reporter, or if we can't get through to the reporter or the reporter's not listening, sometimes we'll go to an editor. The more objective the fact is, the more likely they are to address it. This happens, you know, with some regularity. It occurs in this space. I heard somebody tell me many decades ago that a local businessman, this was outside the context of anything political. He said, you know, from time to time, you'll see something run in the news media as to which you have personal knowledge. And very often, when a story is written about something and you happen to know a lot about the subject matter, very often they'll get something wrong. It's human nature. It happens. You've got reporters who, perhaps with the best of intentions, are having to digest and then explain a large volume of material in a large variety of spaces. So when they get something objectively wrong, it's sometimes fairly easy to correct. It's a little tougher when you get something that's deliberately shaded, and it's shaded in a way that's unfair. Sometimes you'll get them to respond on that, other times you won't. But you've seen over the last almost 60 years, there's been an evolution in this space that's been brought about as a result of a ruling by the Supreme Court handed down in 1964 called New York Times versus Sullivan. Most members of the public aren't familiar with it, but it basically set a precedent that when, if you are a public figure, either a general purpose public figure like an elected official, or you're someone who's attained a degree of prominence through a particular issue, and you are defamed, your ability to sue and recover damages through a defamation action is dependent upon whether the false and defamatory information published about you was made with what they called actual malice, meaning reckless disregard for the truth or knowledge of the falsity of the thing that was said. What the Supreme Court said at the time was that, yeah, we know that defamation law, this is state law, it's not federal, but we believe that the First Amendment, free speech and freedom of the press protections in the First Amendment require us to impose this standard, regardless of what state law says. Well, it sounded nice at the time in some ways. It sounded like a nice way to protect freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Really what it did is to say, okay, as long as you're talking about a public figure, you don't have to be that careful. In fact, you can be negligent and still not have any consequence in litigation as a result of it. I think we're seeing the natural outgrowth of that, nearly 6 decades later. The fact that sometimes reporting, especially on some political matters, has gotten a little bit sloppy. This is an issue that doesn't get public attention much, but about a week ago, there was a dissenting opinion written in a case handed down by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. A veteran judge named Lawrence Silberman wrote a dissenting opinion challenging New York Times versus Sullivan and saying this is ridiculous. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires it. The courts ought to revisit it. So that's something to stay tuned on.
Yeah, well, that was a lot. And it would probably just be better for a lot of people if it was more accurately covered to begin with. Wouldn't need a...
Right, but when the consequence is low for inaccurate reporting in a certain area, it's less likely to come about if there's no good reason not to. Especially when, you get a better story. You're going to get more clicks. You're going to sell more papers. If the headline is really edgy and is kind of ugly. And that's a real reason to be concerned.
All right. Spectrum access and development. This is fairly technical, so kudos to you for understanding it.
Oh, thanks. Look, everything we do in the so-called gig economy, increasingly all of our lives are enhanced by and affected by our ability to access the internet and online services. And increasingly, more and more of our searches, just about everything we do on the internet is now carried out through a mobile device. And all of that requires access to spectrum. There's a pretty wide range of bandwidths within the electromagnetic spectrum. Some of those, a lot of them are licensed uses, like what your cell phone carrier or a TV station will use. Some of them are unlicensed, meaning local Wi-Fi networks and things like that, where people just know that that's the bandwidth they're going to use within their own Wi-Fi system. But all of that has to be handled in a way that makes sense and that allows people to continue to have access to spectrum. As we get more data-intensive devices, you know, my iPhone today can handle a whole lot of information, more information. It can process a much larger volume of information than my iPhone could 11, 12 years ago when I first started migrating to the iPhone away from the BlackBerry, which feels like the dark ages now, looking back on that. And simultaneously, a lot more people have smartphones than had them 10 or 12 years ago. All of this requires access to spectrum. The federal government is in charge of licensing that portion of the spectrum that's licensed, and it has to figure out who gets to have what. It conducts routinely these auctions that allow a particular provider to use aspects of them. Increasingly, as data transmission technology has improved, we see that a lot of the very best property, if you analogize it to real estate, a lot of the so-called beachfront property can now be found within a portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that's been reserved for the federal government's own use. I believe it's managed, this will shock anyone, of course. The federal government isn't always terribly effective or efficient in the way it manages its own assets. And that is a vast understatement when it comes to its use of its own spectrum. For years, I've been trying to get an effective accounting done of the federal government's use of its own spectrum allocations. Because every time we try to touch it, people from the Pentagon come in and say, oh, nope, can't touch it, and we'll ask why. They'll say national security, and we'll say, yeah, talk to us about that. Can't, national security. They're sitting on this beautiful beachfront property, and they won't even tell us about what they have to have or what they're using it for, much less provide a public accounting for it. So I've introduced a bill that would require the federal government to conduct an audit of spectrum allocations and to provide an accounting for how it's utilizing its own spectrum allocation so that we can identify an opportunity cost, what that spectrum is worth, what it would be worth if we could allow someone else to use it. Because it's not until we conduct that valuation that we'll know how much we have access to. Gotcha.
So maybe the audit would take us all the way back to like Area 51 and it was alien technology.
Yes, I'm sure I can connect it to Area 51. I've always wanted to visit Area 51. I've been unsuccessful in getting there. A few months ago, I came close. I happened to be in Nevada with the National Security Advisor, just a few miles from it, but didn't work out with the schedule.
Well, if you can't do it, nobody else really has a chance. I would like to go too if you ever have an extra pass.
I'll bring you along.
Okay. All right, one or two more questions and we'll open it up to the audience. From President George Washington to President Joe Biden and everyone in between, who's your favorite president?
All right, so we're an embarrassment of riches, of awesome presidents. A lot of people I could choose. The one I'm going to identify for today is Calvin Coolidge. Because, you know, a lot of people will say, oh, it's George Washington, or it's Abraham Lincoln, or it's Ronald Reagan, or whoever they want to name. If they're Democrats, they might say, you know, John F. Kennedy or Barack Obama, or maybe they would say Joe Biden. I don't know. One of the reasons I identify Calvin Coolidge is that he is one of the most underrated presidents in American history, and in particular for a constitutional conservative like me. That is, and what I mean when I describe my political ideology, that's the closest approximation. It's the closest sort of low-resolution image I can give you of my political philosophy, which is that I believe government is necessary, but just like oxygen, water, fire, electricity, and a lot of other things that we need and that we rely on and that help keep us safe and healthy, just like oxygen and water and fire and electricity, government power has to be managed with great care, because it's capable of being abused in a way that's really ugly, in a way that a lot of people will get hurt. Calvin Coolidge was acutely aware of these risks and very conscientious about looking to the Constitution for his source of authority to do anything, his source to act as the chief executive officer of the federal government, and more broadly, his source of authority for any federal action, for making it federal. It's one of the reasons I carry around a Constitution with me. This is not just a prop. My wife jokes that every time she takes my suits to the dry cleaners, if she's dropping them off that day rather than me, she always has to round up the Constitutions because but it's something I keep with me, because you'd be surprised at how often a detail will come up where I have to look back and figure out exactly who has the power to do what. Anyway, Calvin Coolidge was really good at that. In some ways, he has done that more than any other president we've had over the last, certainly over the last century. He's not celebrated in history books, as I believe he should be, in part because he wasn't someone who was there to grow the federal government. He wasn't someone who was there saying, let's make the federal government bigger. I like X, therefore I'm going to respond to that by dedicating a new department or commission of the federal government to X. His response typically was, I like X, X is beautiful, let's not ruin it by expanding government in that area. It is such a simple, poignant, elegant, and very accurate political worldview. And yet it's not celebrated almost anywhere in our history textbooks. That's why I love Calvin Coolidge.
Yeah, that's an answer I did not anticipate, but well thought out. All right, you've got a re-election campaign on the horizon. 1, do you reckon you'll run again? And 2, do you enjoy the sting of battle that is a campaign?
Yeah, I enjoy my job. I'm preparing to run again. I'm up for re-election next year. Each time I run, I view it as a decision that has to be made earnestly every 6 years. The actual decision to run has to be made in the election year itself, toward the beginning of the year when one files with the state of Utah and certifies that one is running. And it's not, I don't think it's a decision that should be made in the abstract many years in advance. I think it needs to be made as one is in cycle, as one is approaching that deadline. So in the meantime, I'm preparing to run again, and the final decision will have to be made between now and next year, and it will be. But I like my job. I'm inclined to keep it, and am therefore running aggressively to prepare to do so. Setting up grassroots organizations throughout the state, aggressively fundraising, and looking forward to, we'll be ready for whatever comes our way.
Great. Well, thank you. All right, so there's a few things we haven't hit on: data privacy and immigration issues related to the Silicon Slopes tech community and entrepreneurship community. Let's open it up to any questions from the audience. Brad, we got a microphone for you.
Oh, great. Senator, I read this morning that there's a movement to cancel the Masters golf tournament in Georgia due to some recent voter registration laws that have been passed there. I wonder what your thoughts are in regards to like HB1 and maybe how some of these things could affect us here in Utah or nationally, how it could maybe shape things, and then really kind of how should we be thinking about this?
Yeah, great question, Brad. If they canceled the Masters or didn't allow it to be held in Georgia, it wouldn't really be the Masters. It'd be something else. I mean, I don't know how. This is something that is tied not just to Georgia, but to Augusta National. That's where it happens to be. Find it perplexing that people who are trying to bring about that cancellation and move it somewhere else are basing it on legislation passed by a state legislature. Now, look, I'm not a Georgia state lawmaker. I'm not intimately familiar with everything that bill does. As I understand it, the portions of it that I'm aware of have to do with the fact that they want to tighten up their system so that mail-in ballots are less easy to manipulate, and so that they can shore up their system against allegations of voter fraud. Those seem like legitimate things to me, as does some kind of requirement that a voter prove his or her identity when registering to vote and or when casting their vote. And I don't know all the details of how they go into that, but those are legitimate objectives as a matter of public policy. They are, moreover, objectives that are legitimately within the domain of a state legislature, here of the Georgia state legislature. It's not up to us in Washington to decide how Georgia runs its voter registration database, how it prints its ballots. We've got some residual authority in Article 1, Section 4, when it comes to U.S. Senate races and U.S. House races. But even there, the default authority rests with the states. We generally don't exercise that authority much, even with respect to U.S. Senate and U.S. House races. All other elections, including U.S. presidential elections, by the way, all of that stuff is an area where the states have not only primary authority, they have exclusive authority. It is not our business to decide that. As long as they're not doing something that's unconstitutional, that is their domain. So why then are they trying to cancel the Masters or to move it somewhere else, which doesn't make sense, because if it's not at Augusta National, I don't know how that's the Masters. Why are they trying to do that? Well, I'm sure there's some enormous political pressure that's being brought to bear, and they're tying it up with H.R. 1, the legislation you described. Insofar as they're saying we don't like the Georgia legislation and we really like H.R. 1, I would point them to some things in H.R. 1 that are really, really problematic. Number one, it attempts to federalize a whole bunch of things that are exclusively within the domain of the states to decide. It's not the federal government's business to decide how a state runs its voter registration system. It's not the federal government's business to tell a state that it may not purge regularly its voter rolls of people who have died or moved from the state or registered to vote in another place such that they can't vote there anymore. All those things are accomplished by our H.R. 1. H.R. 1 would also replace the current Federal Elections Commission with a new politicized federal election authority that would easily be subjected to the will and whim of whoever the current presidential administration is. There are myriad policy problems with H.R. 1 in and of itself. Those problems become amplified significantly when you take into account the constitutional ramifications of it, including the fact that at least in the Senate counterpart to H.R. 1, which is so far being referred to as S1, they also want public financing of political campaigns, meaning they would have a significant number of federal dollars going to back someone's campaign. Now, I understand how people get caught up in this and why, from the outside, or at first glance, that might be appealing to some people because they want to say, oh, we want to make money less significant. No, it's not really solving anything, and you're compounding a whole bunch of other problems because that begs the question, how is the federal government going to decide which campaigns it supports and which it isn't? Then you've got the government increasingly in charge not only you've got the federal government increasingly in charge of federal elections and even who gets on the ballot, who gets funded. All of those things, when you subject them to federal control, create enormous problems. So to anyone who's trying to cancel the Masters, because Georgia, pursuant to its own constitutional authority, enacted laws to protect voter security, I would ask the question, how dare you? It's not your business. And I hope that whoever is pushing for that is called to account for why it is that they think that the voters of Georgia can't be entrusted with their own government.
Got it. I was really happy till I heard that question. I was unaware of that even possibility. Diogo.
Thank you. My question has to do with our ability to recruit and import good talent into the community here. So in the past 18 months, our companies have raised over, I should say, close to $300 million and brought it to the state of Utah. Some of those companies are now opening offices in, Seattle and other hubs, which frankly, as a Utahn a little bit, and definitely as someone that came to this place as a place of gathering, I look at that and I go, oh, let's not open that. Let's actually import people here. How do we bridge that gap, if you will, that we're seeing right now by maybe enabling that legal immigration to be a lot more prevalent, if you will, and bringing highly qualified talent into the state so that we don't have to open offices, whether those offices are in Seattle, Austin, or Brazil, which we do have some companies that have to resort to just due to the lack of talent here locally.
Yeah, so one of the many problems with our current immigration system is that it's like we've been building on the same chassis since maybe the 1950s. We've got an immigration code that's outdated and it's strained by all these add-ons that the original chassis wasn't really intended to handle. I don't think a single stroke overhaul of the whole thing is politically possible or necessarily even advisable right now, but we can and should start with some more particularized reforms. One of the reforms that I've been pushing for years, for most of the time I've been in the Senate, and that we came darn close to fixing last year, relates to a particularly pernicious and discriminatory feature of our Immigration and Nationality Act that involves and ends up having a big effect on employment-based immigrant visas, many of which have significant impact on the tech space. One of the features that worries me most about that is that we discriminate against people on the basis of the population of their country of origin. Imagine if you've got two would-be immigrants, both seeking employment-based immigrant visas, immigrant A and immigrant B. Let's assume that immigrant A and immigrant B are alike in every meaningful respect. They're alike, in fact, in every respect except one, meaning their education, their background, their record, the fact that they're law-abiding individuals who have job offers, none of the risk factors are present. They are identical in every respect except one. Immigrant A happens to have been born in Liechtenstein, a very small country with a very small population. Immigrant B happens to have been born in India. Immigrant A, assuming everything else pans out, between the time immigrant A applies for the employment-based immigrant visa, the green card, will likely receive that green card in less than a year, possibly 10 or 11 months. Immigrant B, between 80 and 100 years, most of the time, based solely on the fact that immigrant B was born in India. This doesn't make any sense. Nobody's ever been able to explain to me any legitimate policy reason why we would want to make sure that immigrant A gets here in less than a year and force immigrant B to wait until immigrant B is surely no longer going to be alive. And at the earliest, people in immigrant B's category are at least going to have to wait 20 or 30 years. That's at the short end. It doesn't make any sense. So I've been trying to close that feature in the immigration code for the better part of a decade. We came really close last year getting it passed. We ended up getting it passed through the Senate unanimously, a way to start weaning off of that system and develop another system that allows us to accommodate people regardless of where they were born. At the last minute, it got stalled out in the House of Representatives and wasn't able to pass. But if we could start with features like that would end up having a favorable impact, I think, on our tech sector, that'll help us get to a better place where we can start looking at visas more broadly and the areas of our economy where aggressive growth is going to require a slightly different course of action than we've been taking. But I think the surgical precision of these step-by-step reforms is going to be essential toward our getting this. Every time we end up getting stalled out on immigration reform, it's when self-appointed geniuses of both parties will get together and say, hey, let's just make one big bill. It's sort of like the kid who making cookies tells his mom, let's just make one enormous cookie instead of making a bunch of them. Doesn't necessarily turn out the way you want if you don't know what you're doing there. And most of the time when they try to just make one big immigration reform bill, Congress chokes on it, meaning it's so big that it can't be digested and it can't gain the confidence that it needs. So anyway, step-by-step reforms, including those referring to the country of origin discrimination, I think that'll help us move in the right direction.
Any other questions from the audience? All right, real quick with this example, Liechtenstein versus India, you said you asked somebody why that was, 10 months to 80 years. Who do you ask? Who are you asking?
Nobody really seems to know.
Okay.
But the working assumption, I've asked colleagues, I've asked immigration experts, the best theory that I've heard that at least allows me to explain it is that at some point maybe someone was trying to prevent too many immigrants from coming from any one country at any given time. In many ways, in the past, that might have been sort of a thinly veiled attempt to avoid an otherwise valid accusation of racism. I don't know. But yeah, I think the best argument one could make, but again, this raises eyebrows in terms of making one wonder whether, when they first started adopting this policy, whether they actually had racist motives in mind. I don't know. I don't know that there's any way of proving that. But those in the past who have defended it have typically said, if there are some countries that are getting all of our visas, all of our employment-based immigrant visas, that might not be fair because we want to be a melting pot for more nations and things like that. And look, I understand that. But that itself isn't a good reason to put this limit based on where you were born. There are other things we can do in other areas of immigration law. There's no reason in the case of employment-based immigrant visas why we ought to be taking care of that through that particular mechanism, especially because we're dealing with a relatively small percentage of all people coming into the country from outside the country when it comes to this particular type of visa.
Yeah. Interesting. All right, one last question, but if there's any from the audience. Boston has a question. Until the mic gets to him, my last question, whether, we talked a little bit about reality and perception, but why do national politics appear to be so contentious?
They appear to be because in many ways they are. I think it's often exaggerated in the way you see it. It's not that the media is necessarily trying to exaggerate it, but you don't. There was an episode of The Simpsons once where they were making fun of what the world would be like if there were no political controversy. And they showed someone in front of the U.S. Capitol holding up a sign that looked like a protester sign, but that said, "Everything's fine, nothing's wrong." And you would never see that, because why go to Washington? Why go to Washington to stand there and hold up a sign to say everything's okay? In some ways, that's the natural outcome of how the media operates. It's news. It's more likely to be newsy if there is disagreement. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think it's become more contentious than it needs to be, for the simple reason that we've consolidated too much power of government in one government. Our system of government is not supposed to be one in which there is a national authority that dictates everything. In many countries, in fact, in most countries, the national government is the sole sovereign government of that country, meaning that local authorities might still be locally elected, but at the end of the day, what they can do, what they can't do, what their priorities ought to be, is necessarily handed down from the federal government. Our system, while it exhibits some of those characteristics, our system, when properly understood in the Constitution, really isn't that. We have dual sovereignty. We have the federal sovereign that's sovereign as to things that are made federal, primarily those identified as such in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, including national defense, weights and measures, trademarks, copyrights, and patents, postal roads, immigration laws, bankruptcy laws, granting letters of marque and reprisal, declaring war, and things like that. And of course, regulating trade or commerce between the states with foreign nations and with the Indian tribes. That, in a nutshell, is the federal power. The text of the original Constitution made clear, and the 10th Amendment made more abundantly clear, that things not made federal by the Constitution are reserved for the states. And so it's not just that the states operate more locally. They are their own separate thing, their own sovereign entity. If we allowed our system to function the way that it's supposed to, there wouldn't be, look, there would still be controversy at the national level, because there's always going to be controversy on many of these things, including when and whether to go to war, including how channels and instrumentalities of interstate commerce are regulated. We'd still be having the discussion within Congress about things affecting the internet, like Section 230. Those are federal things by their very nature. But if we could limit and narrow the scope of those things that are made contentious within the federal government, we'd disperse a lot of the angst. Think of it this way. Federalism, when we follow it appropriately, allows more people to get more of what they want in government and less of what they don't want in government. I referred to my friend Bernie Sanders earlier. Vermont and Utah have very different political tastes, preferences. I have it on good authority that most of the people in Vermont would much prefer to have a single-payer, government-run, government-funded healthcare system. It's one of the reasons I'm not likely to live in Vermont anytime soon, but that really is their choice. They could, and I believe would, do that more effectively, more efficiently, more quickly, more completely, if we didn't already have such a consolidation of power and regulatory authority in the federal government in the area of healthcare, which shouldn't have, in most instances, been federal to begin with. That's one of the areas where we see a lot of controversy. So that's why it's become more contentious at the national level than it should have been, is that we've given it more power. Think of it this way. In business terms, you hear people talk about family businesses and how it can be difficult running a family business. If you've ever run a family business or known anyone who has, you probably know what they're referring to. I've certainly seen it. One of the reasons for that is that with a family business, when you've got multiple members of a single family all earning their living and dependent in one way or another on the success of that business, everything's personal. Everything affects everyone in a very direct way. And well, a government's different than a business. The scope of our partnership, the scope of the corporate rules, the articles of incorporation, of the way any entity is structured can be set up so as to minimize or maximize the risk of controversy. Our system was set up so as to at least narrow the field of controversy. We could do better. It's not going to mean liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans are always going to agree everywhere. They're not. It just means let Vermont be Vermont, but let's let Wyoming be Wyoming and let Utah be Utah. We'd be better off that way.
Yeah. Last question, quick one, Boston.
Yeah. Senator Lee, like Garrett mentioned before, you are in the news a lot, and like you mentioned, it might not be the best light or opinion or title that is created. I kind of wanted to know personally, how do you deal with all of those negative titles or newspaper lines?
How do I deal with it personally? In other words,
Correct.
Yeah. Number one, it's not easy. It's not fun. There's nothing about it that is made fun or that is made easy. My mom and my wife are from time to time asked by people, how does he have such thick skin? And they both laugh because I don't think anyone has such thick skin that things like that don't bother them, especially when there are things that aren't true or that are unfair or that are needlessly made more personal or more nasty than they need to be. I don't think there's anyone who just isn't bothered by that. And if you did find someone, you wouldn't necessarily want to trust them with a lot of authority, because that would be weird. So, look, you do the best you can to identify the set of things that you want to accomplish, what it is that you can do. And you have to outline what those are and then stick to that program and be true to what you think would help people and not harm them. One of my very first rules, I have a number of rules that I try to follow. Stick with the Constitution, refer to it, even though people might disagree as to the way they read something. If you read it and refer back to it frequently, even though not everyone is going to agree with your interpretation, if you try to adopt an interpretation that is the most accurate, you're going to be well served. But another one of my rules is first do no harm. Before you even get to the constitutional question, before you vote on something, before you vote for something, even if you think it's going to be wildly popular to vote for and it's going to make you wildly popular to vote against it, if you think it's going to harm people, it's your job to say so. And it should not be your job to vote for something if it would harm them. So I just try to focus back on that. It doesn't make it pleasant. It doesn't make me any more popular to be able to do it, but I think that is the way it has to run. One of the differences between, it's always important to remember that we are first and foremost a republic, or a constitutional republic, rather than a pure democracy. Pure democracies almost never exist in reality, because in order to run a government, you can't have all the people making all the decisions all the time. It becomes wildly inefficient. That's how republics evolved, where people outsource the authority to make certain government decisions to someone else, and they choose who that person is going to be. Within a republican form of government like ours, people will take different approaches to how they view their role. Some will view their role as that of delegate, and the role of delegate, some will define to mean, show me what the people who voted for me want, and then I have to do that thing. But the other role that people conceptualize is that of trustee, where your job is to find what would be good for people and not harm them, and you have to do that thing. There's no single right or wrong answer to that. People will conceptualize it differently. Not everybody will use even the same terminology in that. But I tend to think that one has an obligation in elected office, particularly in the United States Senate, to follow the trustee model, because your obligation is first to do no harm. You're constitutionally sworn to uphold and protect the Constitution, rather than doing whatever you think a majority of people might answer in response to a poll question that they might want you to do. So anyway, bottom line, the short answer to your question is, when I get criticized on something, I try to remember what it is that I'm doing and why it is that I'm doing it. Doesn't make it easier, but it helps me to stay the course in what I think is right. And to reiterate over, it's my job to help explain to people why I do what I do, and the popularity or unpopularity of a certain position doesn't excuse me in my first obligation to follow the Constitution and first do no harm.
Cool. Well, thank you, Senator Lee. Pretty cool country that we live in.
Indeed.
Indeed. Thank you for your time. This has been fun and insightful, and if anyone fancies themselves as a senatorial candidate, that's kind of what you need to know. Everything, science and history and politics, not an easy job. So thank you for your time today, and we appreciate all the support you've given us over the years.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all you do.
CBRE is pleased to partner with Silicon Slopes in providing you with this town hall event. Our company first landed in Utah the year that I was born, 1984. And since then, it's been one of our top priorities to partner with really great community organizations. We admire the impressive contributions that Silicon Slopes makes to our great state. As a director of global advisory and transaction services, our group focuses on helping companies grow their real estate footprint nationally and globally. In doing so, we take into account your company's goals, reducing cost, scaling quickly, maintaining flexibility in your space, or maybe just finding the markets with the very best talent. It's never been more important and also more difficult than now to develop the right real estate plan globally. And yet, tech companies reach out to CBRE as the global gold standard in developing their real estate plans and carrying out their real estate needs globally. We help you physically take your company to the world. 2/3 of the globe is covered by water, and the other third is covered by CBRE. We invest in technology so that we can help you invest in your future. Find out more about how we can help you at cbre.com.